So our talk tonight, we're shifting gears to a new section on the existence of God. So we started out distinguishing two kinds of theology, and back at the beginning, natural theology and sacred theology. And we said natural theology is that which one can do by reason alone, and sacred theology relies on revelation. And sacred theology makes use of natural theology like a handmaiden, like a servant, an instrument. And so that's what we're going to be doing in the next few talks. We'll be following St. Thomas. So St. Thomas, he begins the Summa asking what is theology, and that's what we've been following up till now. And then he goes in question 2 to treat on God. And since human reason can know things about God, such as that he exists, it's useful for the theologian to demonstrate rigorously, philosophically, those natural truths, even though we also know them by revelation and by faith. All right, so that's what we're going to be doing in the next few weeks. All right, so this is the theologian making use of philosophy as handmaiden. Now, some people might think that's rather pointless for the theologian to make use of philosophy in this way, or excessively arduous would probably be a better objection. And there is obviously a lot of truth in that objection, that it's arduous, but not that it's excessively arduous. Now, some people might object, isn't it enough to have faith in God's existence and other truths like that, the immortality of the soul? Why bother to prove them if we already believe them? And there are many reasons that we can respond with. One is that not everyone believes them, and so it's very useful to give the arguments of reason. And these are called preambles of faith. A preamble of faith is when you demonstrate something that reason can know about God, which then makes it much easier for a person to accept the motives of credibility that we talked about last week. That would be one reason. And another reason is simply because demonstrating them is satisfying to the mind. Demonstrating that God exists with reason is reason's perfection. It's the very perfection of reason to get to God through reason, through the things that He's made, because He's made all things in such a way that they point to Him. And therefore, getting to Him through them perfects our mind and helps us to appreciate creation as a pointer to God. And the third reason is to help us understand the harmony of faith and reason, the reasonableness of faith. Obviously, faith goes beyond these natural truths, but faith builds on them. And God also reveals them. And so showing the harmony of faith and reason helps the believer grow in faith, hope, and charity. And then finally, these demonstrations can help answer the objections of non-believers. And in our world today, with at least in the West, with atheism increasing, seems like every decade for the last 2 centuries, atheism makes some kind of advance, or at least agnosticism. For that very reason, it's useful. And then also, not only for atheists or agnostics, but also for those who believe in God but have wildly erroneous ideas about God. And that would be the case of all kinds of phenomena like New Age, Eastern kind of syncretism with Eastern philosophy or religion, as well as things like Mormonism. And so having right ideas about God is useful for, being able to show these truths through reason is useful for entering into dialogue with those with whom we have no other common ground. Okay. Now, Revelation itself tells us that reason can do this. And we find that both in the Old Testament and in the New. In the Old Testament, we find it in the book of Wisdom, chapter 13, a magnificent text, which says, quote, "All men were by nature foolish, who were in ignorance of God, and who from the good things seen did not succeed in knowing Him who is." All right, so the book of Wisdom says that the atheist is foolish. Is foolish because not simply he's sinning against faith, but he's foolish because he's not seeing something that he ought to see with his reason. And it continues, so they were foolish because from studying the works of God, in other words, the laws of nature, studying nature, they didn't discern the artisan. It would be like going to a museum and looking at these paintings or whatever they might be, whether a museum of technology, looking at these trains, and missing the fact that they were made by human beings, that they were made by intelligence. Right? That would be kind of wildly foolish. Well, we might ask, what more shows that it's made by intelligence? Looking at a bunch of trains that maybe are rusty and dead and not functional, or being here and seeing human beings. That's rather more shows the artisan than anything that we do. That's understatement. Those men were foolish, wisdom says, who from studying the works didn't discern the artisan. But either fire, wind, or the swift air, or the circuit of stars, or might of water, or the luminaries of heaven, they considered gods. All right, now we might think, we don't do that. We don't think that the stars are gods. But I wonder, if someone is an atheist and thinks that nature has no cause, and is just the first thing, and is, in fact, the unexplainable, the laws of nature, aren't they deifying the elements in some sense? Maybe a different sense than the ancient paganism, but... So wisdom continues. Now if out of joy at their beauty they thought them gods, let them know how far more excellent is the Lord than these, for the original source of beauty fashioned them. Or if they were struck by their might and energy, I don't know if that was true 2,000 years ago, it should be more true today, no? When we look at these incredible pictures of the nebula and galaxies and the little, the microscopic as well as the macroscopic. If they were struck by their might and energy, let them from these things realize how much more powerful is He who made them. For from the greatness and the beauty of created things, their original author, by analogy, is seen. That's the key line there. From the greatness and beauty of created things, their author, by analogy, is seen. We don't see him directly, but only by the analogy, seeing the workmanship, we infer the artisan. Just like seeing the train in a museum of trains, we infer the engineer. And then it concludes, but again, not even these are pardonable, those who appreciated the beauty of nature. For if they so far succeeded in knowledge that they could speculate about the world, how did they not more quickly find its Lord? Right? How much that applies to our society, because we've expended far more energy, intelligence, will, sweat into investigating the beauty and greatness of created things. And that's a glory of our civilization. And then the conclusion, well then, shouldn't we be more able to arrive at their author, right, from that knowledge? So that's in the Old. And in the New Testament, St. Paul makes a similar argument more briefly, but with the same idea that from creation we get to the Creator. So this is in Romans chapter 1, at the end, 18 to 23, he says, "The wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and wickedness of those who in wickedness hold back the truth of God, seeing that what may be known about God is manifest to them. For God has manifested it to them." And we might ask, well, how? And he answers, "For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes are clearly seen, his everlasting power also and divinity, being understood through the things that are made." The things that are made, the nature, right? The galaxies, the mountains, and the molecules, and above all, our nature. So through the things that are made, his attributes are clearly seen. And so St. Paul is saying, through the creation, we ought to be able to get to the Creator, and if we don't, there's some moral problem. There's some reason that has a different cause than simply lack of intelligence. And likewise, the Psalm 14, says, "The fool says in his heart, there is no God." And the Psalms rather frequently make this kind of observation. So it's, on the one hand, it's the mark of the fool, but the Psalms also give us the motivation. They say the denial of God comes from the desire to do one's will, and then the saying, "There's no one who sees." God does not see. God does not hold us accountable. So, for example, in Psalm 10, he thinks in his heart, God has forgotten. He has hidden his face. He will never see it. Right? And that's a very small step. He will never see it. He doesn't exist. Why does the wicked man renounce God and say in his heart, "Thou wilt not call to account"? Right? There is no judgment. Okay, so that's the scriptural background. And the magisterium of the church has, in fact, infallibly taught that reason can know God's existence with certainty, that we can demonstrate God's existence. The First Vatican Council was in 1870, and the reason why, it might seem surprising that the church would define that reason can know God's existence. And the reason for this was because in the late 18th century and 19th century, the philosophical world became increasingly dominated by philosophical agnosticism. In other words, philosophical currents that denied man's ability to know reality in general, and much more significantly, any reality that transcends the empirical, and thus God. And so the First Vatican Council was responding to philosophical agnosticism, and it said this: "If anyone says that the one true God, our Creator and Lord, cannot be known with certainty, with the natural light of reason, through those things which are created, let him be anathema." Right, so those words, "let him be anathema," are a sign that the church is teaching this definitively. And things that are taught definitively can't be untaught. Right? In other words, they're infallibly taught. But of course, Vatican I isn't saying anything different than St. Paul in the Book of Wisdom. Now, given the fact that this, so let's just presuppose that this is true. Scripture tells us, the First Vatican Council defines it. Right, so we accept that. Now we're going to demonstrate it in a few minutes. But before we do so, let's reflect on this. Why is it that so many people aren't convinced by these arguments? Does that, in fact, mean that it's not true, that we can know with certainty the fact that not everyone is convinced? And the First Vatican Council doesn't say that everyone can know easily. It says that everyone can know with certainty. Nor does it say that this can be known in exactly the same way as one can prove a theorem, say, in geometry. Because in proving a theory in geometry, moral dispositions are irrelevant. But in proving God's existence, moral dispositions are very relevant. So why is that? What moral dispositions might be an obstacle to recognizing that God exists? Well, I think it's not hard to see it. If God exists, then the first conclusion is, I am not God. Which means I am not the one who defines things. If God exists, I am not the lawgiver. I'm not the center of the universe. And I'm not the planner, but I'm the planned. I'm the provided for. I'm the one under the law and not the law. Now, a healthy mind ought not to object to that. But if someone's mind does object to that, they won't be the first one. Even Satan. Now, Satan has no trouble seeing that God exists, right? Satan's intelligence is a little better than ours. But the same lack of moral disposition was there, right? Not wanting to recognize that. In other words, seeking the first sin, Satan's sin, it seems, was seeking a likeness with God that the creature can't have, which is to take his place, to supplant him, to be the source, rather than be from the source. Every creature is made to seek to be like God, but not to seek to supplant God. Or not to seek a likeness with him that a creature can't have, to be the lawgiver, to be morally autonomous, to be the center of all things. And so even if Satan couldn't rebel against God's existence, in some sense, that moral disposition of wanting to be God, he's the type of it. And so it seems that was also the first human sin. Again, it wasn't that Adam and Eve were denying that God existed. And so Satan doesn't tempt Eve directly with thinking that he doesn't exist. But first, tempting her to think that he's not good, and that it would be better to be morally autonomous, to define good and evil for oneself, to be the source of good and evil, rather than to... It seems that that's the meaning of the original sin.
But that wasn't the temptation.
Well, I think that it was, simply because the meaning of the biblical word no, well, it has more than one meaning, but it can mean to dominate. And so I think that the temptation was to have a dominion over good and evil. And that's precisely what a creature can't have. This, at any rate, is John Paul II's interpretation in various places. I think it's the encyclical on the Holy Spirit, Dominum et Vivificantem, and then it's also alluded to in the Catechism briefly. But be that as it may, that temptation continues all through human history, right? And that's that's what's behind sins, especially all sins of pride.
Isn't that what subjectivism is? It's the person determining for himself what is good and evil. That's what our culture believes.
Right. And so even though that doesn't in itself involve the rejection of God, it is the immediate disposition for making one want to see him not exist, or make one prefer to presuppose that he doesn't exist. That's exactly what the Psalms were giving us as the fool. The fool, he doesn't see, right? He doesn't take account. He doesn't avenge. He isn't. And we find this in some of the most notorious, what's the right word here? Certainly some of the most famous atheists in terms of philosophy, Nietzsche and Sartre. And so their atheism is defined as, basically, comes from this reasoning. If God exists, I am not God. And that's intolerable. God must not exist. Now, nobody reasons exactly like that. But there's a non-acceptance of God that comes from not wanting to be from Him. And I can relate to this as having been an atheist for 29 years. That's the shift that a person has to make in going from atheism to belief in God, or even philosophical acceptance of God. Now, there can be another form that this can take is the problem of evil. And it would be that I can't accept God's providence in what He's permitted if there's a God. And so we're going to come back to this in 2 talks from now, and we'll look at the problem of evil. But clearly the problem of evil combined with an attachment to temporal goodness, right, can be a motive for not seeing the arguments for God's existence. And then finally, it's simply humility is the virtue of willing not to exalt oneself above the truth. If there's a God, I'm little, but infinitely little compared to Him. And of course, the ironic thing is, it's only because there's a God that we're really big. That's the real truth. But it can seem the opposite. Right? Only because there's a God we're really big. Why do I say that? Because we're made in His image. And all human dignity comes from the fact that we're made in the image of an infinite God. And if there is no God, then nobody has any dignity in reality. That's the truth. But it can seem the opposite at first sight. Those are more philosophical problems. The problems may be very particular. It may be simply that one was raised in a family in which there were extreme prejudices to or it may be that one is living in such a way that is contrary to the moral law. And even if one wouldn't go so far as not wanting to be subject to the law at all, St. John, in his first letter, speaks of a threefold concupiscence that he, in some way, sums up what he calls the world. The world in Scripture is often used in a negative sense. And obviously that it doesn't mean that the world was... the world can have more than one sense. The world of nature is made good. Right? We just saw Wisdom, chapter 13, speaking about the beauty and greatness of nature. The world. But the world can also mean social... the media, the dominant social messages, the convictions that are socially dominant in society. And that gets the name of the world, a world that's hostile to wisdom, always. Not just in 2013. And he says that the world is ruled by these three things: the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life. And those are the three things that make it hard to recognize God's existence. And especially the third, right? The pride of life. And what facilitates recognizing God's existence is having that pride humbled, right? By some recognition of one's own need. And thus, it can be that personal experiences such as the death of a loved one, so the very experience of the problem of evil can facilitate coming to recognize God's existence because it involves recognizing one's own neediness. And I'll give a personal example for that in a couple of weeks. Now somebody might say, if moral dispositions make such a difference in recognizing these arguments, then are these really arguments of reason? And I would say, yes, they're arguments of reason, but they're arguments that require one's whole reason be sound. And thus they're different than arguments, say, in geometry that only require, say, a mathematical kind of reason. In other words, when we reason about God and when we reason about the moral law, the reasoning is immensely aided by how should we put this? Love aids one's perception of moral issues and of God's existence. And why is that? We often say love is blind. But the fact is that love enables us to see certain things better because we care far more deeply about them. And it's that way with the proofs for God's existence. And this means that the believer is better able actually to see them than the unbeliever. And so they're not so good for bringing people actually to the faith. But that doesn't make them any less true or profound.
The example maybe you're looking for is our perception of our mothers.
Yeah.
You could have a definition of a mother, but the experience of it,
Right.
of the mother's love, gets you to see the reality of the mother much more than the definition of it.
Right. And because of this, we're going to... the most effective arguments for the existence of God are what are called the reasons of the heart. But I'm not going to give those tonight. Tonight I'm going to give the reasons of the head. And in 2 weeks we'll give the reasons of the heart. All right. So we'll talk more about these moral disciplines in 2 weeks when we look at them. But before I'd like to do that, I'm going to give St. Thomas's arguments, the famous 5 ways. And that'll take us 2 weeks. Tonight and next week. And he gives 5 proofs, and we might ask why. And there's more than one reason for this. One reason for giving more than one proof is that if somebody has a hard time with one of them, well, you give them another one. Because they're not easy. That's one reason. Another reason, more significant, is that they actually show different things about God. So the 5 ways show us... or they give us the starting point for understanding who God is in a complementary way. Right? And we'll see that in our last talk when we look at who God is. We'll see that each of these 5 ways tells us something different about who He is. And a third reason is because they start from different starting points, and thus they reveal also different things about the world's dependence on God. They show us the world's dependence in different areas, and thus they lead us to Him from those different dependencies. So I'm going to start, St. Thomas starts with, I think, what's most evidently dependent on God, but not most profoundly dependent. He starts with movement. Right? If there's movement, there's got to be a cause, and we're going to see there's got to be a first cause of movement. I think that's the most evident dependence on a cause, is movement and change. But why do I say not the most profound? Because there's a still more profound dependence, and that's our very being. And operation follows on being, And both of those are dependent on God. But we're going to start tonight with the movement. Now, in all of these 5 ways, what St. Thomas does is he starts with something that's absolutely evident, that everybody sees all the time, but that we maybe take for granted. All right, the first thing probably we don't take for granted, and that's movement. We look out in the world and we see that everything is changing all the time. And nobody can doubt that, unless you're a crazy philosopher. Of course, there have been philosophers who doubted everything, including change. And there's actually a famous one, Parmenides. But, all right. But we're not going to doubt it. Second principle in all the proofs of God's existence is some aspect of causality. And this is self-evident. Everybody simply knows that if there's a change, there has to be a cause for that change. Right? There's no change without a cause. And nothing can be its own cause for its own change. One part can cause another part to move, but one thing can't be its own cause. Everything that changes or moves has to be moved by another, at least insofar as another part of the same being. All right, so our will moves our intellect. We're self-movers. But it's 2 different faculties, one moving the other. All right? And everybody naturally grasps that. Right? And this is why everyone can come to know that God exists, because there's not anyone who gets to the age of reason who doesn't know that an effect needs a cause. A change needs a cause. A movement needs a cause. A movement in the sense of change. Now we can put this in more philosophical language if we like, and it's when something moves or changes, it's going from a potentiality into an actuality. Right? So it's a passing from could to is, and thus there's from potency to act, potentiality to actuality. And to do that, you need a cause. Right? Potency is what can be, act or actuality is what is. Now I had somebody might say, "Oh, that's too." One of my students did an experiment with their 6-year-old, to see if their 6-year-old could understand these 2 ideas, potency and act. So they light candles at the dinner table, and so they, before he lit it, he said potency, explained to I forget her name, Carol, whatever, 6-year-old, and then lit the candle, act, right? Potency, act, unlit, lit, and then he wondered if he didn't really think that she got it. But a couple weeks later, Grandma came for a visit, and I forget if there was, maybe it was somebody else who had this heavy perfume on, and Grandma said, "Wow, that's potent," and little Carol said, "Don't you mean act?" All right, we might have trouble with the terminology, but the idea everybody understands. That's the point here. And everybody understands that to pass from potency to act, you need a cause. All right. Now, what about the objection? It seems that some things cause themselves. I think we've already answered it. Right? Something can cause itself only if it has parts, and one part's moving the other. So it's still being moved by another. It's still being caused by another. And even in our own experience, think of our interior life. We move ourselves by our different faculties interacting with each other. And so it's always one faculty moving another faculty. Right? For example, our will is moving. My will right now is moving my limbs. My will is moving my mind to reflect, and my mind will give the reason for my will choosing something. Right? So our faculties move each other. Right? So I think everyone can see that movement has to be moved by another, even if it's another part. And then we see that we have chains, right? There are chains where one thing moves another, which moves another, which moves another. Right? So someone's hammering a nail, the hammer's moving the nail, and that may be moving other things. The arm is moving the hammer, and what's moving the arm? My will is moving my arm. And then what's moving my will? Well, some idea that I have in my intellect is the motive for my will wanting to move my arm to hammer a nail to build a house. Right? So we see these chains of causes. And in every chain, we understand that there's got to be a first. Right? There has to be a... but then chains can be joined to other chains. And so you can have longer and longer chains. Now, maybe I didn't fully explain why. Somebody may object. Well, why can't something move itself without any parts? It's because that would be contradictory. Because to move yourself, here now I need those terms, act and potency. To be moved, I have to be in potency. I can't yet be actualized. But to move myself, I have to already be in act to be able, because to move requires actuality. To be moved requires potency. And so it would be contradictory to for one thing to move itself without a distinction of parts. So even God can't cause himself, because he'd have to be to cause, and he'd have to not be to be caused. And certainly the same logic goes for any creature. No creature can cause itself.
Did any of the scholastics get to the infinite regress objection?
Yes, so we're going to do that in a second.
Okay.
So so we've seen that nothing can be its own. So therefore, everything that is moved, that changes, needs another as a cause. And now we get changed. So let's take the infinite regression argument. Could it be that, all right, this needs a cause, and the other, you get a chain? Perhaps that chain goes back infinitely of moved movers, of caused causes, and thus there's no reason to hold a first. All right, what should we do with that? All right, so atheists often make this argument that an infinite regress of moved movers makes the first cause unnecessary. Suppose you're at a train crossing, and there's this long freight train, and you see this car moves that car, and then another car moves that one, and another one moves that one, another one moves that one, and so you might suppose, well, there doesn't need to be a first, there could just be infinite, each one moving another one. All right, I think this is the strongest objection here, or in fact the only objection. Take another example, dominoes. So you have a whole series of dominoes. Each falling domino knocks down another domino, which knocks down another domino, which knocks down another. And so perhaps somebody might think, well, there doesn't have to be a first, there doesn't have to be a finger that moves the first domino, because the line of dominoes just goes back infinitely. What should we do with that? The easiest way to think about this is to use the idea of a set. So we've got we've got moved movers, and we've got a chain of them, a chain of moved movers, in which A moves B, which moves C, which moves D, which moves E, which moves F, etc., etc. All right? Now, the atheist claims there doesn't need to be a first because you can just go back to infinity. And so what we're going to do is simply bracket all of the moved movers. I will just consider them all together. The whole set of moved movers. And here's the question. This set of moved movers, just lump them all together, however many there are. If you think they're infinite, that's okay. If you think they're finite, that's okay too. This whole set, is it going to move something else? Right, here's change right now. Will it move? And I think it's evident that it won't, because the whole set of moved movers is like one moved mover. And a moved mover will only move if it's moved. And so what this shows is that it doesn't make a difference how many of these there are. They all need something to cause them outside of the set of moved movers. Well, what kind of mover is outside of the set of moved movers? Oh, only an unmoved mover. We're not saying how many of these, but there's got to be at least one. Right? There's got to be at least one mover outside the set of moved movers. Otherwise, the whole set is never going to move. And it doesn't make a difference if anybody thinks this set is infinite.
If creation, if nature has always existed, if it goes back infinitely, if it's infinite and always existing and eternal, then there's nothing that set it in motion. It always was.
No. So Aristotle is the one who is the author of this argument. Aristotle, in fact, thought that there's no beginning to time. He thought that there's no beginning, that eternally back there always was movement. There never was a first movement. But he uses this argument to show that there's got to be a first cause of the whole chain that's not in the chain. A different kind of cause. Different from this, this domino moving that domino moving that domino. It doesn't depend at all if you think that the universe had a beginning in time or didn't have a beginning in time. Because the person who first thought of this argument wrongly thought that the universe didn't have a beginning in time. Right? And we know by revelation, and also I think by science, that the universe does have a beginning in time. We know with certainty by revelation and with the kind of certainty that science can give.
Just for clarity, are we saying the unmoved mover caused the movement within the set, in the chain, or is it moving the entire set?
Well, he's moving the entire set, right? Because this thing over here, good question. So, say D moves E. In virtue of what can D move E? Only in virtue of the movement given by the unmoved mover. So therefore, the unmoved mover is moving every single one of these. Right? There's not any movement in the universe that's not from the first mover. But it's not immediately from the first mover. Right? This is why he gives us causality. Right? God gives to his creatures the power to move other things. And we move other things all the time. But we can't do it if we're not moved. But he doesn't have to move us immediately. There may be times in which he does. Yeah. And we'll explain that. But it's not necessary for the argument.
Is there a third argument against the infinite regress we were saying?
that's a different. I'm going to leave that out because that's an argument for a different kind of problem. Was there a beginning of time or not? But it's much better to abstract from that here. Just like it's better to abstract from the question of how many of these there are. That will deal in a different question. All right? Now, the best image to use. Now, in all of these things, the problem is if you use A's and B's and sets, it's abstract, and the mind likes concrete images. And so I think the best concrete image here is one that Scott Hahn applies very handily for this, which is precisely that one of the train. So you're at this train crossing, and you have to wait and wait and wait, and train after train after train. But nobody thinks, just because you're waiting for half an hour at the train crossing, that there isn't actually an engine car. Right? Nobody thinks that. On the contrary, the more cars that pass by, what do you think? That engine's pretty powerful. That it can pull 100 cars or 1,000 cars. Or if somebody said there were 1,000,000 cars, you just need an engine 1,000,000 times more powerful. All right. If the cars are infinite, what kind of engine do you need? An infinitely powerful engine. So does adding on the cars, adding on the dominoes, does it actually diminish the power of the first cause? No. Right? It shows that simply there's just as much necessity, in fact much, much more, if you have an infinite number of movers. Because it simply means that the unmoved mover is moving infinite things instead of finite. Now we in reality don't believe that. We believe that these moved movers are finite, but for a different reason. Because God revealed, in the beginning, God made heaven and earth. And so the believer holds that. But St. Thomas Aquinas, he thinks that philosophically you can't prove it one way or the other. Other philosophers like St. Bonaventure thought that you could, but it's a different question. It's irrelevant to our question about whether God exists. All right?
Does the Big Bang Theory come in play here?
Yeah, the Big Bang Theory just serves as a kind of nice image, but it doesn't come into play in this proof, because whether there was a Big Bang or not, this argument remains exactly the same. The Big Bang has to do with, can science provide an argument for the world actually having a beginning? And it seems that science can. Not all scientists like this, though, because, and this is totally beyond me. I'm not a physicist, so I'm trespassing in talking about this. But Newton had the idea of a universe that, at least as far as physical law is concerned, would go infinitely back. And if there was a beginning, it couldn't be understood by physical law. But in the 20th century, one of the most magnificent things of empirical science is the discovery of the red shift. That in looking at the galaxies, it's apparent that the galaxies are moving further apart. And if the galaxies are moving further apart, that means that they were originally, in other words, if there's a linear kind of movement, or even more than linear, it seems that there's an increasing velocity of this expansion. It points to a singularity, right? And that's what people refer to as the Big Bang. In other words, you can trace it back. So physicists trace back that expansion, and you trace it back to this singularity beyond which there's no tracing and there's no more physical determination of what the previous state was. And add to that another law of physics, that entropy is increasing. Disorder is always increasing. Because some scientists don't like this, because the Big Bang. For the simple reason that it seems to very much support this kind of picture. And that's why we ought to find it rather marvelous. So some people have thought, well, if you had a Big Bang and this expansion, perhaps at some future moment there will no longer be an expansion, but a shrinking back and a collapse. And that collapse will be followed then by a rebound. And perhaps the same thing happened in the past. In other words, perhaps the Big Bang that we're tracing it back to, perhaps that was in fact not the beginning, but a mere rebound from a previous bang and crunch and bang and crunch and bang and crunch, right? So somebody might think, well, maybe you had bangs and crunches back to infinity. For our purposes, it actually doesn't make a bit of difference, right? Because we're just bracketing them all. So if we've got in here a bang and a crunch and a bang and a crunch, it doesn't make a difference, right? They're all safely within the brackets. Brackets are wonderful in philosophy because it's called abstraction. You're abstracting from what's irrelevant. But nevertheless, I think it's impossible from the point of view of science, but it doesn't make a difference from our point of view here.
Or thinking across into metaphysics, the physicists
Right.
don't know where they should stop.
Right, that's right. But let's just say something about science, though. It seems that it's impossible that you had infinite bangs and crunches going back because disorder is increasing. That's a linear thing. So that means that in the expansion and then in the crunch, the new crunch and followed by a new bang has got less oomph than the previous one because energy was lost. And so you can't go losing infinitely back. And in fact, there's a book on this, which written by a physicist, Robert Spitzer, New Proofs for God's Existence. I don't know if I got the title exactly right, in which he goes through the physics of this, if anybody's interested. But it's important to note, it's totally irrelevant for St. Thomas's argument.
When you talk about a first mover,
Right.
aren't we, in thinking of things being moved, aren't we thinking of them as being static or inert, whereas we're not considering the atomic...
No, we're not. We're not at all. We're thinking that the exact opposite. In other words, what this picture shows us is that in nature, there's this incredible dynamism. And that's just the point of departure. That's what we see looking out in the world, is we see this dynamism in which things really are moving. We're not saying that they're inert. We're saying that they're moving. We're just saying that all of that movement's got to have a cause, that's all. And a cause, and this is the key, of a different kind. And that's where people have the trouble making the leap. So I tried this on my dad, physicist, atheist physicist, and it fails. It fails because he couldn't at least, I hope this won't always be true, but he had difficulty making this leap to a different kind of cause. Because then so how do you tell that somebody's having that difficulty? Because they immediately ask the question, well, who caused that? Well, wait, this is the unmoved mover. In other words, we've just shown that there's got to be one mover that doesn't need to be moved and isn't moved in moving. Now again, the difficulty is that we've let that abstract. It might be helpful to have a picture for this, a mental image. The fact is that we do have experience, I think, with unmoved movers. Not the first unmoved mover, but obviously God, we're looking for the first unmoved mover, that's God. But there are unmoved movers that we come across all the time. And those are things that signify. And they're not changed by changing something else. So, for example, any great work of art just sits there on the wall. It's not changed by the fact that I look at it and am profoundly moved. So it's doing, or a book, right? Whatever, pick any work you like. Brothers Karamazov. It's unchanged, and I read it and I'm profoundly changed. There are many things that move others without themselves being changed. Now that's obviously not the first cause, the Brothers Karamazov, because it was made by somebody else. But it's not impossible that there be an unmoved mover, because we have experience of things that move others without themselves being moved at that moment.
It seems like you've changed the name of the set, though, from moved movers to unmoved mover being outside this. You're calling the unmoved mover the uncaused cause.
Right.
Would you don't you, if you call the unmoved mover the uncaused cause, you have to call the set
That's true.
cause causers.
Right. I'm treating these as equivalent for the moment.
Okay.
And the reason for that is because we're using the word move in a broad sense. I'm taking by move not only physical movement, but also movement that's not physical. For example, when our intellect moves our will, and our will moves our intellect, that's not a physical movement. But we do use the word movement. In other words, there can be changes that aren't physical movements. And so when we say a chain of movers, I think it's equivalent to a chain of causes. But St. Thomas, you're right, does actually distinguish these two, and that's the difference between what he gives as the first way and what he gives as the second way. I'm going to get to that in just a second. Marcia?
Just a note about bangs and crunches. Have they discovered that the things are moving apart at ever increasing rate? So
Apparently, right. It doesn't look like a crunch is in the going.
I think that the physical constant that would be necessary for crunch to happen is of the wrong magnitude.
Right, that's right. Uh-huh. Which is recent, no? I mean,
Only in the last, 10 years.
right. Mm-hmm. Anyway, we can leave that to the physicists. Let's look at. What's the difference if we, instead of movers, look at cause? The second way of St. Thomas is practically the same as the first, but instead of looking at it from the point of view of the thing moved needing a cause, he looks at it from the point of the what we can call secondary cause. A secondary cause is a cause that's not the first one. So all of these can be looked at as things moved or as things moving, right? Each one of these moved movers is at one and the same time moved and moving another. So we can consider them as things that are moved and thus they need a cause of their movement. Or we can look at it from the point of view of they're things that can cause other things. That's marvelous too. In other words, what's marvelous in nature is not only that things are moved, but what's maybe even more marvelous is that things can move other things. And so but when we see things that can move other things, we see that they, in turn, need to be moved in order to move. So again, let's take our example of the person making a statue or hammering, making a house. The hand moves the hammer, and the hammer moves the chisel or the nail, and that cuts away something in the statue, etc. But the hand is moved by the mind, and so the hand is a mover, but the hand exercises causality, but its movement depends on something else being a mover, the will being a mover, and our will depends on the fact that our intellect thought about making that statue or house. And that our will maybe directed our mind to think about it. And we could go through a whole bunch of causes within us for making that statue. But ultimately, you'd have to come back to a first kind of cause. Everything that we do, we're moved by something, right? We're moved by a desire for happiness. No artist is going to make a statue, no architect is going to make a house if we didn't want something first. That was the cause of everything else that we wanted. This is just an analogy. And we can see, therefore, that desire for happiness is moving all of our other willing. And then that's moving my hand, and that's moving the nail. So there's got to be something moving even my desiring happiness. Oh, what? Is there a chain behind there? Well, we don't have to... I think it's God. But it doesn't matter for our proof. For our proof, it's enough to see that there are things that can move other things only if they, in turn, are moved. And so we can call these movers caused causes by looking at the side of activity rather than the side of passivity. So this is the longer answer to your question. All right? So whether we call them movers or caused causes, there's got to be something outside that is going to be both an unmoved mover and an uncaused cause. Let's take another example. Bodies move down to the center of the gravitational field. So what moves the body? Well, it seems that there's some physical force in both bodies, in this body and in the Earth, that are moving this thing to the center. But then we might ask, well, what causes the causality of the force of gravity? And so maybe a scientist will discover some other force that's underlying the force of gravity. And then maybe some other scientists in the future will find some other even more primary force moving that other force that's moving the force of gravity. But you can all see where this is going. There's got to be some first thing giving to all of those powers their power to cause. And most people just, scientists, and not just scientists, people just simply take this for granted, right? We take for granted that our nature has power to do things, and the nature of bodies gives it this power of gravity. And we don't stop and think, but what gives to gravity its power to cause? Right? There's got to be some cause that's not caused, that gives causality to all these secondary causes. And again, we can put them all in a set, and we can lump them all together, and there's got to be something outside of the set that gives the power to cause to all created causes. And what do we call it? God. What can we conclude from all of this? That there are two kinds of causes. Only one of them are we going to encounter empirically. We can only encounter empirically caused causes, moved movers. But there's got to be this other kind that's radically different in kind, because these move by passing from potency to act. But this one, what's it got to be? It's got to be just act. It's got to be pure actuality. And no potentiality. Because if it has potentiality, it's inside the set of movers. And we need another one. So there's got to be a first that is the source of all dynamism. And so this uncaused cause, is this something inert and static? Infinite opposite of inert and static, right? This is infinite power, right? Because pure act.
Just to get clarity, it causes potency causes act, passes from potency to act. Is the potency itself an act of a prior potency in the stream of causality?
That would be a different argument. The potency, insofar as we're looking at here, no. But you're right. This itself requires an explanation that there is a potency. How did something get a potency? Because nothing, pure nothing, doesn't have any potency. You have to be something to have potency. And so but that's already a more profound question. Looking at is there a cause of potency? Here we're looking at the cause of this, the passage. And we say that's got to have a cause and God's that cause. It would be a different argument to say even this needs a cause. And that's actually the third way. But it seems like we're running out of time.
Why do you think the atheist scientist has such a hard time grasping this?
Because it's a totally different way of thinking. The empirical scientist is trained to study movers. That's what he does. Because his method is to investigate what's empirical. That's the nature of empirical science. And one would be doing very bad empirical science, unfortunately this happens often, if one went out of the mentality of empirical science and started to pontificate about unmoved movers, still thinking one's doing empirical science. This happens all the time when people make theories of everything and so forth. But the very nature of empirical science is that it can only function in the set. And therefore, to pose this question, they need to change disciplines. Put aside the empirical science and begin to philosophize. But in order to do that, they would need to be formed in philosophical thinking and recognize that it has different methods and different kinds of demonstrations. And it's rare that you find a person who is well formed in both ways of thinking. In some sense, it's inevitable because life is short and art is long. Art and science and philosophy is very long. But yeah.
At the seminary, we have lots of engineers and a couple of physicists.
That's true. Yeah, it's possible to do both, but it's hard to excel at both.
But when they use logic, how do they get around intelligent design?
Well, many natural scientists are excellent at this. But I think among the best natural theologians, what we're doing here is philosophy, right? But many of those who do this best are those who also know and are some scientists who can do both things. And those who do intelligent design theory, I think, are good examples of people who are doing well both fields, even though their principal thing is science and not philosophy. People like Michael Behe in biology, I think, is a great example of putting together the two disciplines, even though he's principally a scientist. Unfortunately, theologians seem to be the last in picking up the torch of intelligent design. But St. Thomas, we'll see next week, is the first great theorist of intelligent design. It's fifth way that we'll get to next time. There's what the third way I've given you here in the last. Maybe I'll just say the essence of it. The third way is a little more difficult to grasp, and he's starting from a different starting point. The starting point here is, if anybody needs to leave.
The sponge is full.
The sponge is full? I should give up? Okay, I'm just going to summarize it. The idea is this. We look out in the world and we see that things have a time span. And they're not necessary. They can be and not be, each one of us. We've got a time span, or at least in our bodily life. And it's impossible, if you think about it, that everything be like that. Because if everything is just simply for a time, there's no guarantee that it's not going to run out. Now, we don't actually think that we're not worried that bodies are just going to stop and there's just going to be a void. We're not worried about it because we naturally think there's something that's necessary and unchanging, and that's matter. Everybody presupposes this, and rightly. And so, yes, this body is going to fail, but it's going to become something else. It's going to become dust. And that dust might become a tree, and that might become something else, etc. But we're not worried that things are just going to fail, and maybe everything will all fail at the same time, and there'll just be a big nothing. And if there's a big nothing, nothing's ever going to happen after that big nothing. Right? If everything is of the kind that begins and stops, and there's not anything that's not of that kind, what guarantees being in the world?
Why do you need a guarantee of being in the world?
Well, because if you have infinite time back, and there's not anything that's necessary continuous all through it. See, the thing is, we all think matter is that necessary thing.
But it's convertible to energy.
Okay, matter and energy, whatever you like. A matter and energy convertible thing, something's necessary. Matter convertible with energy. Otherwise, and so every physical scientist actually thinks that there's something necessary in existence. All right, I'm just going to, something necessary, matter and energy together. We've got two choices. That necessary thing is the cause of its own necessity, or its necessity is caused by another. In any case, you've got God. And we're going to show later on that God can't be matter and energy. Yeah. But it's another proof. But it's enough to show that there's got to be a first necessary being, whatever it is.
Because there are unnecessary beings.
Like us.
Yes.
Uh-huh.
These are all three the same proof, in a sense.
Sure, the whole structure of them is the same. That there's got to be something outside the set of what we empirically encounter.
It all goes
To
back
be
to causality.
Right. The foundation for what we encounter every day and what we ourselves do. That's right. Let's take our break here and then questions and answers.